Welcome to this episode of History Unfiltered, and today we look at the alternate history of World War II and ask the question, what if Hitler never invaded the Soviet Union? The history of World War II is pretty well known. Adolf Hitler rose to power with his Nazi party and became the chancellor and leader of Germany before beginning to invade nations all over Europe in his conquest of the earth. Then in 1941, he invaded the Soviet Union, where they would eventually be defeated, and thus begin a retreat back to Germany with the Russians in hot pursuit, now fighting a war on two fronts. But what if this never happened? Hitler held a negative view with communism. While the term Nazi does stand for National Socialist German Workers' Party, there is a glaring difference between socialism and communism. Communism seeks to eliminate classes, and this is where Hitler disagreed. He despised the Marxist idea that classes were immaterial, and opposed the thought that all workers were equal. Hitler believed that classes were necessary because his ideal Germans were the Aryan race, and he considered them far superior to the lower classes of Germans, especially the Jewish people. The main difference, philosophically, between communism and socialism boils down to their founding principles. Communism states from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, whereas socialism is from each according to his ability to each according to his contribution. Communism views economic resources as being publicly owned and controlled by the government. Socialism, namely Nazis' version of socialism, still views personal property as important, but industrial production is communally owned and operated by a democratically elected government. However, Nazi Germany was not viewed as a democratic government when Hitler stayed in power. Hitler was a totalitarian. Let's not confuse that. But he was also not only anti-communist, anti-Semitic, and wildly nationalistic, he was also anti-capitalist. And the difference between him and Stalin was in this area. You see, Stalin could tolerate capitalist societies among the world, viewing them as peaceful coexistence being necessary for his regime and his nation to survive. Germany didn't view it as such. While Hitler despised communism, and after all, the Soviet Union was the largest and most prevalent communist nation at the time, he was willing to prioritize his enemies to a degree. His main foe was the arbiter and chief architect of the Treaty of Versailles, the French. The Treaty of Versailles had crippled Germany and made them weak, and this was what Hitler viewed as the biggest affront to German people's pride. He aimed to change that, but before he could begin his conquest of Europe, he needed to ensure that he would face little opposition. In August of 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact in Moscow called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Soon after, Germany invaded Poland from the west and Russia from the east. It was decided in the German-Soviet Frontier Treaty that the Soviet Union would annex Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and that the two nations would split control over Poland and Romania. The following year, Hitler would invade France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, completing his Western control of Europe. The pact between the Soviet Union and Germany was planned to last a decade, where it would expire in 1949. It didn't make it this long. After France's surrender, Hitler set his sights on the Soviet Union. The resource-rich region to the south, as well as the fact that Hitler viewed Slavs as just as impure as the Jews, made Russia a prime target. But it was Hitler's plan all along to invade the Soviet Union, since the writing of Mein Kampf in 1925. Hitler viewed the Soviets, which he claimed were ruled by Jewish Bolsheviks, as some humans. and despised them for primarily racial reasons. There was also the need, in Hitler's eyes, to establish and secure Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. Hitler also viewed the failed conquest of Russia by his predecessors, the Kaisers, as a glaring error committed during World War I. So on June 22, 1941, Hitler ordered the commencement of Operation Barbarossa, named after the Holy Roman Emperor and Crusader Frederick Barbarossa. The invasion of the Soviet Union saw over 3.8 million Axis forces cross over into Soviet territory, the largest invasion force in the history of warfare. The Eastern Front had now been opened. The operation was supposed to be over quickly, with the seizure of Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad planned to be completed before the brutal Russian winter set in. But supply lines grew strained, and the blitzkrieg tactics were not as effective as before. The operation stalled at the Battle of Moscow, and the Soviets staged a winter counteroffensive that pushed the Germans back. It was finally the defeat at the Battle of Stalingrad that marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. In retrospect, Hitler is well known for making some very large blunders in his time as the ruler of Nazi Germany. Chief among them were the two most pivotal and costly: the invasion of the Soviet Union and the formal declaration of war on the United States on December 11, 1941, just days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and America's entry into war with Japan. Of course, the United States was contributing to the war effort in Europe, as they were providing material aid, support, funding, weapons, and even some personnel to the British in their fight against Nazi occupation of Europe. Among some of his other mistakes, Hitler also declared himself commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, or German armed forces, and reserved the right to make all strategic and tactical decisions. Hitler's only military experience was that of a runner for the Bavarian Reserve Infantry in World War I, where he was just an enlisted man. He had no experience as a leader, tactician, or even held extensive knowledge of military doctrine. His other glaring mistake was that the level of fear he struck into his subordinates was to the point where it was exceedingly rare for his staff and military leadership to ever question, correct, rebuke, or go against the opinion of the Führer. With Hitler already fighting the British in the West, his decision to invade the Soviet Union is viewed as the turning point in the war and spelled doom for the Nazi war machine. But what if this had never happened? Today we ask, what if? What if instead of commencing Operation Barbarossa, Hitler decided to hold off the invasion of the Soviet Union? What if Germany maintained their pact with the Soviets and continued to have a split Poland acting as a buffer between the two powers? Let's say that Hitler still declared war on the US in this hypothetical scenario, and the only difference is that he just didn't invade Russia. Would Germany have been better equipped to repel the Allies following the invasion of Normandy? Let's say, for argument's sake, that the Allies still defeated the Germans in North Africa, and that the campaign for Italy still took place, with Patton and his Seventh Army still taking Sicily, and the American-British campaign into the Italian mainland was successful. This hypothetical scenario concerns mainly the European theater following the defeat of the Germans in North Africa and the fall of Benito Mussolini. Technically speaking, Germany stands alone, but only fighting on the Western Front, now with the United States having entered the fray. Would the D-Day landings have been successful? Hitler now has a much larger force of both troops and tanks, as well as much less stressed supply lines. His battle-hardened Heer, or army, with the exception of the North African campaign, having seen only success up until this point in Europe. Would this now larger fighting force have been able to hold back the Allied advance? Would the Allies maybe have been defeated? Or would the war have just raged on for longer than into the 1945? Of course, technologically speaking, the Germans had some advantages, but the Americans had a powerful industrial machine, working tirelessly with contributions from most sects of society contributing to the war effort, both financially and materialistically, as well as a draft that could pull people from various walks of life with various experiences to come and help fight the war. But America was facing a war on two fronts. It is still surmised that regardless of what would have happened, the United States still would have won out the war, and that America and her allies would eventually be successful in their campaign of liberating Europe. We also have to ask, what of the chances of the Germans forming a military alliance with the Soviet Union? History shows that the primary reason for the invasion of the USSR was along racial lines, so it's unlikely that Hitler would have entertained any alliance with the Soviet Union. While he did have an alliance with Japan, who he also considered racially inferior, they were far removed from the European theater and enjoyed a sort of out of sight, out of mind consideration. It is likely that Hitler would have simply maintained his non-aggression pact status with the Soviets, and it's very likely that if he had seen success in defeating the Allies in the West, or at least holding them to a stalemate, that he would eventually push into the Soviet Union. But what of the Soviets? Would they have eventually seen the inevitable threat posed by Germany and allied with the US and England? Would they have entered the war at some point anyway? After all, Stalin did see the non-aggression pact as a perfect opportunity to hold off conflict, seeing as the Soviet Union was at a distinct industrial disadvantage and wanted more time to build up resources and industry. Another consideration for this supposed alternative timeline of World War II is concerning the race for the bomb. In 1941, under the War Department's supervision of General Leslie Groves, the United States initiated the Manhattan Project. Overseen by physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, this endeavor was viewed as a race for the atomic bomb, a race that at first was seen as the US being far behind Germany on. It was later revealed that German scientists were nowhere close to getting the bomb, but progress in Los Alamos, New Mexico pushed on until July of 1945, when the first atomic weapon was ready to be tested. Codenamed Trinity, July 16, 1945, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first atomic bomb was successfully detonated. A month later, two more devices, codenamed Little Boy and Fat Man, would be dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. This was a series of events that would not only end the Second World War, but also change the course of human history forever. Mankind was now in the nuclear age. But what if the war in Europe was still raging since Germany didn't invade Russia? Would Truman have used the bomb against Germany instead of Japan? Or both? What city or cities would have been targeted? Would this have brought about the end of the war the same way that it did with Japan? Or would it have further provoked Hitler to dig in and fight harder and push his scientists to develop their own bomb so it could be used against the Allies? And would the atomic bomb have been used in an act of desperation with Germany potentially now winning the war in Europe? If the tide had turned the other way and the United States was on its heels with its allies, this could have been an act of desperation. It could have been the point which would turn the war the other direction. And what would this have done with the Soviet Union and our relations with them? Would the Cold War still have transpired in the way that it did? Would an atomic blast in Europe still have precipitated a nuclear arms race? It's interesting to examine what might have been if things played out just a little differently throughout history. We are certainly fortunate that the war went the way it did and ended in such a quick fashion. Who knows how many more lives on all sides would have been lost if the war had protracted on long past 1945. We shudder to think what World War II would have been like pushing into the 1950s, or possibly even into the 1960s. Or, alternatively, the darker thought, if Germany had come out successful and pushed back the Allies and conquered Great Britain. We'll never know, But it is interesting to look at these facts from history and see if things had played out just a different way, just a little differently, to change history and reshape the world in a different way than what we currently know it as. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.